Right. Are the participants in, Urvashi?
We have about 19, 20 attendees, sir. They're joining. So give it another minute and you can start. I'll give you a heads up before.
All right. You connect. ये verify connection अभी तक नहीं हो रहा देखो. Verifying and connecting. How have things been with you, Reshma?
They've been hectic. It's become a little better last couple of days. So, how have you been?
Oh, I've been well. I was in Calcutta for a training course on oil painting conservation, and I've just come to my mountains. So I'm at this place called Himalayan Society for Heritage and Art Conservation, and we're having a course on conservation of stone sculptures.
Okay. And I have to say, I'm envious because of where you are.
It's a nice place. Yeah, it's a nice place to be in.
Anything Himalayan just sounds dreamy.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, sir. You may begin.
All right. I don't see any students, any participants here on the screen, right? This is a webinar format.
Yes, it's webinar. You will not see their faces or hear them. Once we start the Q&A session, then if required, I will enable audio for participants. But since it's a webinar, you will not actively see or hear any attendees.
But if anybody would like to speak, then we will see the chats and we will respond to them as it progresses. Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the next talk on the Italian art history lecture series by who's now becoming a very favorite Reshma Nair, Dr. Reshma Nair.
I'm sure there are lots of them, right?
And I was talking to Francesca Mendola, the director of the Italian Cultural Center, and they are thrilled with the success of this talk, and it augurs well for a larger understanding of the arts of the world, of these maestros who are they're world citizens, so to speak, right? Their work transcends boundaries and culture. Their works transcend languages, and the enrichment of that is for everybody. Students around the world have emulated these artists and have become artists in their own right with all these experiences they have gained just through looking at other people's works of art. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci in his Ritratto della Pittura also wrote that he advises young artists to copy the old masters so that you understand the rigor that goes behind creating those lines and those forms. And eventually when you become artists in your own right, then of course you have your own freedom to do what you want to do. One of these famous artists, ladies and gentlemen, is Sandro Botticelli. And Reshma will introduce the talk to you. And the particular painting, Reshma, as I understand, one particular painting you will focus on while you may have your other introduction, and that is La Primavera, the spring.
Yes.
Yes. So, which is at the Uffizi gallery in Florence. So here's to you, Reshma, and let Botticelli delight us all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just start sharing my screen first because I tend to forget to do that when I start speaking normally. So just one sec. If you could just confirm that you can see my screen, that would be great.
Very clear. What a beautiful painting. You just have to make it full screen, that's all.
Yeah, I want to see how I can...
That's the bottom right. Because just beside the size, if you go right, bottom right.
Press F5.
Oh, this?
No, your cursor will have to go further.
I know how to start the slideshow. It was just how to get rid of that little zoom bar.
Right.
This, does anyone know how to get rid of this thing?
Beautiful.
I,
इसको ऊपर कर दो, minimize कर. You can make me mute.
okay. All right. So this is the painting I'm going to be talking about today. It's called the Primavera. Primavera is an Italian word. It means spring, the season of spring, springtime. And it's one of Botticelli's most famous works, along with his Birth of Venus. We'll look at an image shortly. The two images have been considered sometimes to be pendants, though likely they are not. And they were both recorded as being in the collection of one of the famous Medici, not Lorenzo the Magnificent, but his cousin and ward, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco Medici. The two paintings were recorded as being in one of his countryside villas, and specifically in the room, both paintings were in the same room, in the room adjoining the master bedroom of that villa. So there are various theories and a lot of debate as to the exact meaning, and I will be addressing some of that. What's really crucial to understanding the painting better is to keep in mind two things. That, as I mentioned, this was placed in a countryside villa, and it was placed in a room adjoining the master bedroom. Now, there's a lot happening in this painting. When you look at it, you see multiple figures very clearly delineated, and it would appear that it's quite easy to read. Actually, though, it's very complex. And what I'm going to try and do first, before we even look at the meanings, is just look at some details so that we are aware when we're looking at the trying to identify figures, we don't forget the absolute mastery of Botticelli, not just in conceiving the composition, but also in executing it. The flowers, the clothing, the decorations, all of that. I should also say that the color that you see, this darkened background, is a product of time. Okay, so originally the colors, especially the foreground grassy meadow that looks almost black right now and is dotted with flowers, that would have been more green. Okay, so the details, the first detail is from this area. So I'm using my pointer to show you where. You can see fruit and flowers in the background, trees above this group of the three graces. This detail is from the right side of the painting. So just above this figure here, okay, this bluish grayish figure, who, when you look closely, has hair blowing backwards and also has a wing. Just a moment. Yeah. So you can see the outline of the wing over here, and you can see a tree with leaves, probably laurel or myrtle, that is growing in the foreground. This is a detail from the lower left. So the winged sandals of the figure at extreme left and one of the three graces, you see them standing in a flowery lawn or meadow. And amongst the different flowers, and many of them are identifiable, I recognize only the daisies, but note how beautifully Botticelli has placed the figures amidst the flowers. So over here in front of Mercury, this figure is Mercury, we'll come to that later, his right foot, you can see plants growing, and here in front of this right foot of the female figure, and between the feet, you can see stems and flowers. So these figures are placed in a flowery meadow. Out of the group of the three graces, here you can see the feet of the two graces to the right, and something very similar happening. They're placed amongst the flowers. Note also their diaphanous robes and the edges, the way they seem to be moving, because the graces are depicted holding hands in a circle and dancing. So along with their movement, their clothes are moving and being very diaphanous. The movement is very delicate and very rhythmic. I'll come back to that a little later. Here you have the central figure. So there's a figure here that is usually identified with Venus because there's a Cupid above her. So right below her feet, you see more flowers. Okay. And this is a detail where my pointer is. So towards lower right, the figure with a dress that is full of patterns, floral patterns, and this other figure that is being carried by the winged figure I pointed out earlier. Okay? So here there are two things I want you to look at, because once I zoom out and we look at the painting as a whole, or we look at larger details, you won't be able to observe these details. So look at the edge of the drapery over here. How, so when we looked at the drapery of the graces, we saw the transparent quality and we saw the rhythmic movement, right? They're dancing and the drapery is billowing. Over here, the drapery also, and I don't know if this is because more of the painting has survived at the edge, but the hem seems to be worked in a more luxurious manner, if you will. And the movement is based on the positioning of the figure. She is actually being carried by this winged figure. So the drapery is responding to her movement, which is not of her own free will, but she is being carried by the winged figure. The other thing I want you to note, and this will require a little bit of focus. So on the left, you can see a white robe or a white dress with floral patterns on it. And on the right, with this figure, you can see this diaphanous, very transparent dress. And there are some floral patterns which are like dark silhouettes. Now, whether these dark silhouettes are the flowers behind the figure that are viewable beyond her transparent dress, or they are flowers that are decorating the drapery, as you can see over here, here, and here. Or they're actually flowers that have actual flowers in the painting that have been strewn and are basically at this moment suspended in midair around this area. It's not very clear what's happening, but keep all this in mind because it's very relevant to an analysis of the identities of these figures. Okay, I did mention to you that this painting was commissioned by a cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and it was placed in his country villa. Now, along with the Primavera, the painting that you see on the left was also placed in the same room. And it has generally been assumed that the two paintings are pendants and were meant to be displayed together, and their meanings are related to each other. So before we go into the meaning of the Primavera, let's just address the one on the left, which is easier to understand. It's the birth of Venus. So according to mythology, Venus was washed ashore on a shell, the shell serving as an attribute and a symbol of purity, because pearls are usually found in shells, and pearls are very pure objects. So by extension, Venus at the time of her birth was considered very pure, and she is arriving to the shore on that shell, and that she's being borne to the shore by the wind. So if you look carefully, let me just zoom in at these figures on the left. The winged figure that you see is Zephyrus, the west wind. Okay, and you see him blowing the wind, and that is what is pushing Venus to shore. And on ashore, there's this woman in a floral dress with a floral cloak who rushes towards Venus to cover her with the cloak. So let me just zoom out. Yeah. Just one moment. How did I do that? Now, the painting on the left is in size a little smaller than the painting on the right. Okay, that itself suggests they were not made or not conceived of as a pair, but there's something more specific. The one on the left is painted on canvas. The one on the right is painted on wood. Okay, I would think that is evidence enough to understand these two paintings not as a pendant. So they have been placed together, they can be read together, but it is not a given that their subjects are intrinsically related to each other. Okay, now one important point about the Primavera, the one on the right, the one that I am addressing in this talk, is that the central figure is considered by many scholars to be Venus, because there's a Cupid above her, and because it was assumed that this painting is a pendant to the birth of Venus. So the birth of Venus has Venus in the center, it has the god of the west wind on the left, and it has this figure in a dress full of flowers. And you see something similar, you see similar figures. You see a figure in a dress with flowers. You see this is a representation of the same god, Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. So that has been reason enough to assume that this central figure is meant to represent Venus. Now, there are some problems with that identification, and there are also problems with other identifications, because the entire work is not a narrative painting. It does not tell a story strictly. It doesn't take a certain source and just narrate the events of that source. It has a lot of allegory in it. And even those allegories have been selected from different classical sources. Because of this, it's a difficult painting to interpret. And I'm going to be talking about two of the, I would say, convincing interpretations of this painting. One of them which accepts the central figure as Venus, and the other that suggests it is Persephone. And as we go forward, I hope you will understand how complicated it is to assign specific sources to works like this. Now, the reason for that is the humanist culture that was prevalent at the time these paintings were created. So when these paintings were created, late 15th century Florence, humanist scholars were actively studying classical texts in Latin and Greek, and they were translating them into the vernacular, they were discussing them, and they were discussing them with erudite patrons as well as artists. So very often in paintings and sculptures from this period, there are references to specific texts that can be traced, or even to ancient works of art. So ancient Roman sarcophagi, relief panels, descriptions of works of art in ancient manuscripts. All of these formed sources that artists used, or scholars in the employ of patrons like Lorenzo the Magnificent conceived of and discussed with artists, who then visualized and created works of art. Okay. I mentioned this, that the patron, I should just tell you a little more about this patron. So Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici was a second cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He and his brother, so Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici and his brother, were also taken under the guardianship of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, when their father died. Okay? Lorenzo the Magnificent was the greatest art patron of his day, and he sponsored not only artworks and artists, but also humanist scholarship. Okay, so he had in his employ scholars like Angelo Poliziano, Marsilio Ficino, and others who were engaged in translating ancient Latin and Greek texts. Lorenzo the Magnificent himself was a poet and wrote verse that was based on his study of the ancients. And Botticelli lived in this environment, was a patron of Lorenzo the Magnificent, his brother Giuliano, and the junior branch of the Medici, that is the patron of these paintings, Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to focus on the central figure in the Primavera, being Venus. Okay, so we'll try and correlate what we can to the birth of Venus and go over Primavera. And then we will move on with the same painting, Primavera, and try and see whether the identification of the central figure as Persephone instead of Venus is convincing, more convincing, equally convincing. We'll come to that. Okay? So for now, in the painting on the left, in the birth of Venus, you see the west wind with either another wind or the nymph Florence, whom he basically raped and eventually married. And Florence was then converted into Flora, the goddess of springtime. Okay, so you see Zephyrus on the left with a nymph, whether it is Chloris or another wind, we will leave at the moment. We have Venus in the center on the shell, and on the right, you have what appears to be the personification of the season of spring going towards Venus. On the right, now we look at the individual figures. The figure extreme left has been identified securely as Mercury, and this identification is based on the fact that there is a wing on one of his sandals. We'll look at a detail eventually, and he holds up a very specific type of staff, which is called a caduceus. So Mercury's staff has two entwined snakes and sometimes wings on it. When we look at the details, you'll see it's not very clear to figure out what's there, but you can make out the two entwined snakes. And the figure wears a helmet. So this is securely identified as Mercury. Okay? The next three figures are the three graces. The three graces are often represented with Venus, sometimes with Mercury, and often also with Persephone. Okay. Now, In the center, we have this figure, whom I'm just going to say Venus question mark for the moment. And above her, Cupid. Okay, so Cupid is shooting an arrow in the direction of one of the graces. And when we look at the details, you'll see that the tip of his arrow has a flame. And this is important simply because in some of the ancient Latin authors, their descriptions of Cupid in different contexts have him shooting a flame-tipped arrow, or they have the word Ignis in some form along with the their description of Cupid. So those sources sometimes refer to Venus and sometimes to Persephone. But the main thing is Cupid is often associated with fire and especially a flame-tipped arrow. Okay, so to the right of this central figure, you have a figure who is wearing this robe decorated with flowers. Not only is the robe decorated with flowers, and we will look at details, she also has actual flowers collected I'm just going to say in her cloak that she holds up with her left hand. And she is strewing these flowers as she walks. She has a garland of flowers around her neck and around her head. Okay? This figure is a personification of spring. Now, whether the figure is a personification of the season of spring or the goddess of spring is one of the debates that scholars have. For now, let's just accept her as a representation of spring, just as I would accept this figure in the birth of Venus as a representation of spring. That leaves these two figures on the side. One is securely identified. It is Zephyrus, the west wind, and he carries a nymph. Now, whether it's the same couple or not, the point here that we'll try and understand is that Zephyrus in mythology raped the nymph Florence, okay? And he then married her, and she was transformed into Flora, the goddess of spring. Okay. If we accept that this figure is Chloris, okay, then there is a possibility that what Botticelli has represented in the dual female figures between the central figure and Zephyrus is Chloris being transformed into Flora. So I just repeat the mythological story. Zephyrus raped Chloris. He then married her, and she was transformed into Flora. Okay. The other interpretation of these two figures is that the west wind converts the season of summer into the season of spring. And the two female figures here represent the season of summer and the season of spring. That's the groundwork. Okay. Now let's start talking about the painting in a little bit more detail. Oh, I forgot about this. In the birth of Venus, the posture of Venus and the fact that she's nude are directly derived from classical sources. In fact, there were several descriptions in literature of Greek sculptures of Venus. They're called the Venus pudica, the modest Venus. So she covers her nudity with her hands. She's emerging from her bath and she covers her breasts and her genital area with her hands. So this type of representation was quite common in ancient art, and the Medici themselves owned a sculpture of the Venus pudica. So the image at left of the sculpture is the Medici Venus. And on the right, I've just added a few more to show you that this was a very common representation of Venus. So in the birth of Venus, there is no doubt as to what is represented. The figure is Venus. It reprises the pose of the modest Venus. It is on a shell, and it represents the newly born Venus. Even if it's not exactly the birth of Venus, it's the newly born Venus arriving ashore. Okay. Now, in Botticelli's Primavera, okay, as I mentioned, there are associations of Venus with Cupid. And in some versions of the myth, Venus is the offspring, I beg your pardon, Cupid is the offspring of Venus and Mercury. So if Botticelli was looking at one of those versions of the myth, then the appearance of Mercury would not be unusual. Okay? So Cupid as the offspring of Venus and Mercury. And the three graces in any case are associated with Venus. They are also associated with Mercury. Okay? So they were followers of Mercury and attendants of Venus. So they make perfect sense. Now, how do Zephyrus, Flora, and Chloris fit in with this identification of the central figure as Venus? So, in this painting, okay, there are certain sources that, or rather, I would say certain works of art that often represent these groupings. Okay, so over here you have in the center Flora, and this engraving was created a few years after this painting was executed, but it's an example of the kind of imagery that was quite commonplace at this time. Okay, so here you have a procession in which Flora, or springtime, is the central figure, and look at who's right above her, Cupid. Okay? And leading the procession, you have Mercury. So you can see Mercury with his helmet, his caduceus, the staff with the two entwined snakes, and his winged sandals. Okay? And right at the end of this procession, you have Venus and Mars. So in the more common version of the myth of Cupid, he is the offspring of Venus and Mars. A detail of Cupid, he is blindfolded, he has his quiver, and you can see the flame-tipped arrow that he's shooting towards one of the graces. Okay, and he's positioned right above the central figure. So this positioning of Cupid right above this figure strongly suggests that the figure might be Venus. But if it is Venus, why is she clothed in this way? Why is she so demure? It's very unusual. Well, there are sources in classical literature in which Venus is referred to as the Dea Hortorum, the goddess of the gardens. Okay, and in that kind of literature, she is located in I would say in a rural milieu. And keeping in mind that this was a rural villa in which these paintings were placed, there is a strong possibility that the figure represents Venus as the goddess of the gardens, specifically as the goddess of the gardens. Okay, now let's look at this detail of the west wind, Zephyrus, and this figure, who for now I'm just going to call Florence. It might help think about chlorophyll in plants, to think about chloris, the etymology of the name chloris, and how the figure of chloris is transformed into flora. Now, there's a very curious thing happening. If you look at her mouth, there are flowers coming out of her mouth. Okay? We'll come to that in just a moment. Notice how these flowers are reprised on the dress of the figure of Flora right next to her. Okay. In Ovid's works called the Fasti. So Fasti is just a word for festivals. Okay. He speaks in the first person about the goddess Flora. And so I'll just read from the beginning. So I, Ovid, spoke, and the goddess answered my question thus. And while she spoke, her lips breathed vernal roses. I, who now am called Flora, was formerly Chloris. So this is an account of different feasts. And this specific portion, Ovid is talking about how the goddess Flora is telling him that she used to be a nymph called Chloris. And Ovid mentions that when Flora spoke, her lips breathed vernal roses. So there were flowers coming out of her mouth. So it is very likely that Botticelli, if this were the source that he was using, that Botticelli is representing with these two figures. Notice how the hands of Chloris overlap the body of Flora. That Botticelli is representing here the transformation, or rather alluding to, I won't say representing, alluding to the transformation of Chloris into Flora. So Chloris, the nymph, who becomes the bride of Zephyrus and is then transformed into Flora. And that would explain these flowers, which otherwise seem very unusual. Okay. Notice how the flowers, so this is all the painting, it's all illusionistic, but just to understand what's happening in the painting, I'm going to call the flowers on Flora's cloak the embroidered flowers. Okay, so those are the ones that are pictured as if they are part of her dress. And these are, I'm going to say, actual flowers coming out of Floris's mouth along with her breath. Actual flowers that are in a wreath on Flora's head. Actual flowers in a garland around her neck. Actual flowers, actual roses, in fact, held in her garment, which is strewing across, and actual flowers that wind around her waist. Okay? And just one sec, let me see how I can focus in over here. So if you look at Chloris's left hand here, you see something very interesting happening. These real flowers that have come out of her mouth with her breath are coming towards Flora, and the real flowers that encircle Flora's waist are basically behind Chloris's hand and coming towards Chloris. So there is a strong possibility that what is depicted here is, just one moment. That what is depicted here is the transformation of Chloris into Flora. So further down to the same passage, the, Flora continues telling Ovid her story, and he says, this garden my husband filled with noble flowers, and said, goddess, be queen of flowers. So if we follow this source, or if we accept that this source is what Botticelli was looking at, or a similar source, then it seems very likely that this figure is Florence, and she has been transformed into Flora, and that is what Botticelli has depicted. Now, after that whole following the myth of Venus and how Florence turned into Flora, let's look at how the same painting might reference Persephone and a change of seasons. So the central figure then would be Persephone, and this would be Zephyr, not holding Florence, but holding the season of summer that is being transformed, or that is replaced by the, cyclically replaced by the season of spring. Okay. So Mercury securely identified, Cupid securely identified, the three Graces securely identified, and Zephyrus securely identified. I would say Flora, whether it is the personification of spring or the season, the goddess of spring or the season of spring, we just call her Flora and accept her as being securely identified. Now, how does Persephone even come into play in all of this? I'm going to take a step back and just talk about the different classical sources that were available to Botticelli and his contemporaries. So right now, I just showed you some excerpts from Ovid's Fasti or festivals. There are at least 6 or 7, and actually many more classical sources that have been associated with this painting. And each of them has some details that work really well with what Botticelli has depicted for a specific figure or a specific group. But only the Venus and Persephone identifications can work for the entire group. Okay? So now, Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, and she was abducted and raped by the god of the underworld, okay, Hades, or the Roman Pluto. And she was taken to the underworld. She became the queen of the underworld. She pined away for her mother. Her mother was pining for her. And ultimately, she had eaten a few pomegranate seeds, and there was an agreement reached that I think she had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds, that for 6 months of the year, she would return to her mother. And for the remaining 6 months, she would go back to the underworld. So it became a cyclical thing. And whenever Persephone left the underworld, so that would happen every year, the seasons would change accordingly. Okay? So because her mother, the earth goddess, would celebrate and she would break out into flowers and fruit. So basically the arrival of springtime. So that's how Persephone is related to springtime. There are classical sources that talk about the west wind, Zephyrus, his breath, the arrival of the west wind, transforming winter into spring. I'm sorry, I've been saying summer, winter into spring. Okay, so if this is Persephone, then it would make sense that Zephyrus transforms a barren winter into bountiful spring as Persephone heads to earth from the underworld. Okay, and Cupid is often associated with Persephone's to term the entrance and exit to and from the earth and the underworld. Okay? So Cupid accompanies her. The 3 Graces are often associated with Persephone, and so is Mercury. depending, if these were the sources that Botticelli looked at, then this reading would make as much sense as the reading of the central figure as Venus. Now, there were a collection of hymns that are called the Orphic hymns, because they were believed to have been written by Orpheus, that were available in Renaissance Florence, and they were being discussed by the humanists of the day. They weren't published, but there are letters referencing them. And in the Orphic hymns, specifically the hymns to the seasons, you have these phrases. So the seasons whose balmy breath exhales in lovely flowers. So if this figure is not Chloris, but a season whose balmy breath exhales in lovely flowers, and this figure is the season of springtime, a flowery vale delightful to the view, this source would explain the choice of Persephone as the central character. Okay. Now, in the Orphic hymns, there's also a very specific reference to Persephone. Okay, so all the seasons, we're talking about the personified seasons, the 4 seasons. They are attendants of Persephone when back from night. So when she comes back to earth from the dark underworld, the fates and the graces lead her up to light. Okay, so here, very explicitly, Persephone is being identified with the seasons, 2 of which would be depicted here, and the graces who lead her up to the earth from the dark underworld, which is referred to here as night. Okay. Now, this mysterious figure, Venus or Persephone? Okay. Let's look at a panel painting. This is a fresco panel from a ceiling of a villa that was decorated maybe about 2 decades after Botticelli painted his work. And the ceiling of the villa had numerous different episodes, one of which was the rape of Persephone. Okay, so it's Hades carrying away Persephone to the underworld. And look at who we see in this representation: Cupid and Mercury. Mercury with the helmet and with his winged staff with the 2 entwined snakes, and Cupid with his quiver of arrows and his wings. So the association of, just one sec, the association of Persephone with the different figures in the painting is not far-fetched at all. It comes from classical sources, and it was accepted iconography. Okay? Finally, the 3 graces. Okay? I would say the most, apart from Cupid, the most easily identified figures, and very commonly depicted in art of the time. So they were usually depicted in a circle, and they, this is just an aside, the depiction of the 3 graces was a great opportunity for artists to show off how well they could paint a figure, you know, from the frontal view, a rear view, and a 3/4 view. And over here, their linked hands have also been related to writings by Seneca called Benefices, where the benefits or gifts are discussed, how one person is the giver, one person is the receiver. So if you take, for example, this grace with her back towards us, she gives to the grace on the left. And the grace on the left receives it and passes it on to the third grace, who then returns it to the first grace. Okay, so in Seneca's writings too, you have this references to the graces in relationship, if I'm not mistaken, to Persephone. Okay, I'm not 100% sure of it, but I think the relationship in Seneca is to Persephone rather than Venus. Okay. Finally, Mercury. Okay, so what is Mercury doing? Mercury is positioned at extreme left. He's looking up, and with his right hand, he's doing something, right? Now, let me just see, do I have, yes. So before we look at what he's doing with his right hand, let's look at, I hope you can notice this wing attached to his sandal, okay? So Mercury is the Roman version of Hermes, the messenger god, and they would fly everywhere bearing messages for the other gods and for mortals. So they usually have wings on their sandals, helmets, even on their staffs. Okay. So you can make out just roughly, the staff has two entwined snakes, and there are some clouds up here. If we accept the central figure as Persephone, okay, and we accept that Zephyr, the god of the west wind, whose breath turns the season of summer into the season of spring, when Persephone arrives from the dark underworld onto earth, accompanied by Cupid and the three graces leading her, then there's a very specific meaning at that point to what Mercury is doing. So if that is the correct reading of the painting, first of all, the painting is being read from right to left, which is quite unusual. Then what Mercury is doing over here on the top, you can see a cloud, and he's dispersing that cloud. And the entire painting is then an allegory of the changing seasons, because I come back to the location of this painting in a countryside villa. There is classical literature that was studied in the Renaissance about the rustic calendar. Okay, so before Julius Caesar changed, or rather corrected the calendar, the Roman calendar had 10 months that began in March. March was dedicated to Mars. April was dedicated to Venus, and May was dedicated to Mercury. And springtime began in April and finished in early May. So if what we're looking at is an allegory of the changing seasons and the arrival of springtime, the arrival of Persephone that leads to springtime, then what Mercury is doing here, the reading from right to left, would be Mercury basically closing off this episode, because his season of summer will be starting, and his prodding at those clouds on the upper right is likely an allusion to the end of springtime. Okay, so with that, I finished the talk, and I have to assume I probably created more questions than I answered, but that's just a function of the humanist milieu in which this painting was created.
Thank you very much, Reshma. Reshma, can we have the large picture on screen if you don't mind? Because there are questions coming in. I think with reference to the visual, it might be a little easier. One of the questions is about the, it seems as if some of the two ladies are in Chinta, or seem to be pregnant.
Yes.
So anything about that?
Yeah, actually a lot. Just one second, let me hide this. So marriages in the Renaissance were not, especially in wealthy and powerful families like the Medici, were arranged marriages, and they had nothing to do with whether the couple wanted to get married. It was all political. Okay. The scope of a political marriage was twofold. One was continuing the family line, so having a male heir, a healthy male heir, and the second was political stability. So these marriages were calculated to either fend off threats to the groom's family from the bride's family or vice versa, or to consolidate power for the groom's family. So this idea, very obviously springtime and the central figure do look pregnant, and that would be in keeping with the idea that this painting commemorates a marriage. I did not even touch upon this, but there is a lot of very compelling scholarship on how these pictures, this specific painting was placed right next to the bedchamber. It was actually placed, there are inventory records that say that it was placed on something called, I think a lettuccio, which is like a day bed with a built-in storage chest where linens would be stored, and those would be decorated by themselves. And this may sound really crazy, but in those storage chests, which were specifically married chests, like the bride would take it with her in her dowry, there were often rape scenes, okay? Because this idea of, keep in mind, this is not, when we talk about the myth of Zephyr and Florence, he raped her, he then married her, and she turned into a goddess, okay? So in a way, it sanitizes the myth, and it emphasizes what is important, the marriage to consolidate power and the family line. So the short answer to the question is, they do look pregnant. That is probably intentional. I can't tell you for sure what it means, but it definitely has meaning in context with marriages between powerful families in the Renaissance.
Thank you. And what about the what about Cupid being blindfolded? Can you just put in a word about that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he's up to mischief. I don't know. There is some, I don't know too much about this, but there is some debate as to whether his arrow is aimed at this grace or this grace. Okay. So I don't know about him being blindfolded.
Is there a date to this painting specifically? So Rupali is saying that if it predates 1490, she's saying that the troubles of late 1490s in Florence, was there a political statement or something, or
It's almost a given that it predates 1490 by about 10 years. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah. So this was made actually when the Medici were firmly entrenched in power and very, very powerful.
So there are so many things coming that have come to fore in this when we're talking about this painting. So you mentioned all these flowers, and there's a question from Vispi Balaporia. She's saying, what about the mention of the fruit hanging in abundance from the trees? You would like to say something about them? With the fruits that are there?
Okay, so I'll just be very frank. I don't know too much about the symbolism of everything. And I am not even sure, because I kind of assumed they were oranges and they looked like orange leaves to me. But I read a reference somewhere that they're apples, and apples are the fruit of Venus. So I'm confused. I mean, I would need to read a lot more just to identify the most obvious fruit on top. But what I would say broadly is that there is this idea of abundance that comes with springtime. The earth is flowering and fruiting. So, and there is definitely symbolic meaning to the various flowers and whatever fruits they are. I just don't know what they are.
And in fact, when you talked about abundance, the flowers that you see here, they're almost 400 to 500 flowers here. And about almost 200 of them have been identified, Reshma.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And they're
It's
all
quite
local flowers from the region around, Toscana. So
yes.
that. And Rupali says, yes, orange is also because they're commonly found in the Garden of Paradise, and that very often orange tree is used to represent the Garden of Paradise. Yes, Rupali, thank you. Regarding, there was one question about the significance of red of Mercury's garment and his weapon. So
Okay.
you want to mention something art historically about the red, and then maybe I'll tell something about the technology of the painting where the red was concerned.
Sure. So for the garments are not classical garments. They are contemporary Florentine garments. The subject is classical, or rather is derived from classical literature and classical artworks, but the clothing styles are contemporary Florentine styles. The sword is it's not, I don't think it's a normal attribute of Mercury. And I did read somewhere that it's probably an allusion to Mercury being the slayer of Argus. So there's another Greek myth in which Jupiter raped Io, and his wife Hera, Juno, was very jealous. She turned her into a heifer, and that heifer was guarded by an older person called Argus. And Jupiter sent Mercury to free Io, and for that, Mercury killed Argus. So, given the fact that this sword is the kind of sword that is depicted by Botticelli in a different painting about a decapitation, it has been argued that this sword refers to Mercury's killing of Argus.
And Reshma, if I may, I think it's important to tell the guests while we've been talking about this painting. The reds that you mentioned, Bharat, Reshma has talked about the art historical aspect of it. These reds are cinnamons and certain red lakes. And the green that was mentioned, it's turned dark and black, this was alteration of paint that happens when you use a green pigment called copper resonate. In due course of time, it starts turning to brown and darker brown, and then you have coats of varnishes, and then it turns further brown almost, So the contrasts get damaged in some way. So that is something that happened to this painting. Reshma, in 1982, Umberto Baldini, Ornella Casazza, all these people, also from the Opificio delle Pietre Dure in Florence, they are the ones. So this was conserved at that time. Lots of radiography was done on the paintings. I think the people should know that this is not a painting, oil painting on canvas or anything like that. This is a painting. Yeah, it's painting on panels.
Yeah.
On popular wood. So there are, if you go vertically, like you have Mercury, that whole thing is one panel, then one more panel, then one more panel, almost panels right across this. They have been joined together with nails, they have been fixed together with dowels, there are butterfly joints, there are various types of. So all these panels were put together. Then there was a layer of cloth put on it with an animal glue, with hide glue. So the layer of cloth was applied. Over the layer of cloth, you would take gesso, which is like a chalk, and you take rabbit glue, because they are smaller animals, so the glues are a little softer. So rabbit glue and this was mixed together and then used to apply the primer or the gesso coat on top of these paintings. And then it was smoothened, and then these were painted with tempera. So these are not painted, This is a huge, Reshma, what's the size of this painting? This is big. This
Maybe
covers
5 by 8. I have the dimensions at the
yeah,
beginning.
it's 8 feet by 5 feet.
12, 6 or 72, 6.5 feet, I suppose, by 10, 6.5 by 10.
Yeah. So this painting, I've seen it at the Uffizi. It looks huge. It looks bigger than the size actually, also because of the frame and other things. And this is painted with tempera paints. And tempera paints means you have the egg yolk, and you have the pigments. And please remember, this is not as easy as you take a brush and paint. Thin brushes were used, and Reshma had shown some fantastic details in this. Any detail, Reshma.
Yeah, I'll just go to
Every
one.
painting on this is, there are millions of lines, there are millions of fine lines that have built up this painting. I mean, I'm saying millions, if you count them, there'll be trillions.
Yeah.
Billions of lines, thin lines of paint, and it builds the opacity, and it builds up the opacity, and it builds up the opacity. And after that, then you have the diaphanous, where you have again in short strokes, not just painted like that, like big strokes. Then thin strokes of the other colors that come one on top of the other. So you have this fantastic gradation, like if you see the sinews, you see the muscles, you see how it heals, the darkness of there, then the white that comes in. It's all because these are millions of lines, white lines, ochre lines, yellow ochre lines. And they come together and they give you this optical vibration. And that is how, in fact, this was the way from, the Trecentesco paintings, right from the 1300s. You have this fine tempera technique that was used in this. And sometimes there were glazes used, that is a different thing. But I think we must also appreciate the work that went into creating this magnum opus. Yeah, this was phenomenal work. And there's so many things. One of the participants, Reshma, said, is Primavera considered controversial painting? I'll leave you to answer this, and then we will close the session, ladies and gentlemen, with one remark from Reshma.
Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by controversial. There is debate about the central figure and the exact meaning of the flora and the counterpart female figure with her, but controversial otherwise, no. Not as far as I'm aware.
Okay, but this is a painting worth visiting and revisiting. And thank you for this beautiful introduction, Reshma, because it's opened our eyes towards it. It's brought it to our attention. And
Okay.
very grateful to you for this. And it's time that all of us look at this painting again for its beauty. And if you're visiting Firenze, ladies and gentlemen, the Uffizi is just there beside the river. And there's a lovely ice cream shop that sells you good Italian gelato, all the different flavors. The only flavor you should not eat there is farina. Farina means atta. I actually ate it as farina, and it was like I was having this cold atta. It was so bad. Other than farina, try every other gelato. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this lovely evening once again. I'm really enjoying the series. I suppose we'll see you 2 weeks from now. Is it 2 weeks from now, Reshma, or is Christmas coming in between?
No, I think it's 2 weeks from now.
And
It is
what
2
are we
weeks from
talking
now.
then? What painting are we talking about, or what work?
Sculpture, actually. It's the tomb of Sixtus IV. A very fascinating sculpture.
Okay.
And again, related to the humanist milieu.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent, Reshma. So until 2 weeks. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a lovely evening. Have a lovely
Thank
evening.
you.
Yes. And winter time is upon us Indians. Spring is just round the corner. La primavera is just there. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.